Good afternoon, everyone. I guess you can hear me too. Welcome to The Courage to Create, Addressing the Holocaust Through Art. My name is Ilana Benson, and I had a great honor and pleasure to work for Yeshiva University Museum on the exhibition that inspired today's program. The exhibition name is Tapestries by Shoshana Comet, From Survival to Strength. I hope you've all had an opportunity to join me in the gallery earlier, but you're also welcome to visit the gallery after today's program and take another look in light of what you're going to hear during the program today. Before we begin, I just really would like to thank Dr. Shay Pilnik, the director of the Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University, and Deborah Mamet,
right down here,
a graduate student in the program at the Fish Center, for their dedication to the development of this program. They really were the essential forces behind the program today. You'll hear more from both of them shortly. I would also like to acknowledge and thank someone who's not here right now, Gabriel Sanders, from the Center for Jewish History, because and his entire AV staff and other building staff. It's always wonderful to have the support of the building staff when you're a partner in the Center for Jewish History. Finally, last but absolutely not least, I must acknowledge how honored we are to be joined today by Ted Comet, husband of the late Shoshana Comet, whose infectious passion for the topics portrayed by his late wife's tapestries helped inspire the thinking behind today's program. And I will say that Ted is hoping to meet many of you in the gallery after the program. And with that, I'd like to start it off by introducing you to Deborah Mamet.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Deborah Mamet. I'm a graduate student at Yeshiva University's Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Thank you all for joining us today for our program, my capstone project, The Courage to Create, Addressing the Holocaust Through Art. I would especially like to thank our panelists for participating in our discussion today, the museum staff, Alana Benson, Alona Mardoff, and Gabriel Goldstein for helping orchestrate this event, and my director and capstone advisor, Dr. Pilnik, for his guidance and encouragement. I hope you all had or will have an opportunity to view Shoshana Comet's tapestries. Ms. Comet concealed the trauma she endured from the Holocaust until many years later when she was capable of expressing her anguish through her art. She first began weaving in 1968 as a way to convey her and her family's harrowing journey in the 1940s from Belgium to the United States. While weaving her fourth tapestry, War, Ms. Comet suffered from paralysis of her right arm. When no physical reason could be determined, she used psychotherapy to regain use of her arm. It was surmised that the paralysis resulted from her emerging memories. After finishing her fifth piece, she became a psychotherapist to assist other Holocaust survivors and their families deal with their trauma. It was too emotionally draining for her to both weave and provide psychotherapy, and therefore she chose to provide psychotherapy to aid other sufferers instead of focusing on her own trauma. Ms. Comet provided support and fostered growth that promoted self-healing, self-reliance, and service to others. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel of scholars, specialists, and moderator who will lead the discussion. Dr. Ori Soltes will offer insights on Ms. Comet's artistic interpretation and representation of the Holocaust. He is an historian and educator. Dr. Soltes is a teaching professor at the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. He has been the director and curator of the B'nai B'rith Kultznik National Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. He has authored more than 130 articles, exhibition catalogs, essays, and books, and has written, directed, and narrated more than 30 documentary videos. Dr. Soltes has assisted the curation of exhibits for diverse Western and worldwide art in the United States and overseas. Professor Archie Rand will elaborate on the use of art as a means of record keeping and preserving the Holocaust. He is an artist and Jewish scholar and is the CUNY Presidential Professor of Art at Brooklyn College. He has served as the chair of the Department of Visual Arts at Columbia University. Professor Rand's paintings and murals are displayed worldwide. There are over 100 solo exhibitions of his work, and he has also published collaborative works with many known poets. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, our third panelist, Mariya Keselman-Mekler, is unable to join us today. She was to address the use of art as a coping mechanism to recover from trauma. She is a counseling and program manager and a creative arts therapist at KleinLife in Philadelphia. She works directly with Holocaust survivors, immigrants, and refugees. Lastly, our moderator is Dr. Shay Pilnik, the founding director of the Fish Center. Before becoming the director of the Fish Center, he was the executive director of the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Research Center in Milwaukee. He is the grandson of Holocaust survivors who immigrated to Israel from the USSR. Thank you all again for coming. Dr. Pilnik will lead the conversation.
Thank you, Debbie. Can we just give a quick round of applause for Debbie? Thanks. What Debbie has done by putting together this program is creating the best commercial for our Holocaust Studies master's program, the best commercial that I could imagine, because this is her final unit, 3 credits. And when she and I spoke a few months ago, I said, you know what, to actually put together a program and brainstorm, conceptualize it, contact the speakers, choose them, and then worry about the marketing and about the coffee that it's hot and the cookies, there's chocolate chip, there's other types. That's gonna take you the 100 hours of the capstone. Without Debbie's passion and insightfulness and the hard work she put, this would have not happened. So I wanna thank you, Debbie, for being the propeller behind this program. Thank you, Archie Rand. Thank you, Ori Soltes, for joining us. So we are here to speak about, to connect art and Holocaust, and maybe find a way to connect it later to the tapestries that we will go and see. Either we saw before, or we can see later on the 2nd floor, made by Shoshana Comet. I'm not an artist. I have worked as a Holocaust scholar on Holocaust art to some extent, not my area of focus. And I thought that I would really play the role of the layman here, asking very basic questions. So the first basic question that I wanted to ask you is, what's exactly Holocaust art? I suppose that no artist has ever gone to a school of art and said, oh, I would actually like to be a Holocaust artist, especially when we think about Holocaust survivors. I know that Elie Wiesel, growing up, I can think about Viktor Frankl, Primo Levi, they became Holocaust writers, but it wasn't really the career path that they chose before the Holocaust. So what does it really mean to be a Holocaust artist in 2024 or before? Dr. Rand.
Thanks. Writing is a declarative, projective culture. As Gertrude Stein said to Picasso, writing isn't the same thing for a writer that painting is for a painter. So there's a different set of rules that applies to how one faces that kind of trauma in a creative situation. If you're an artist, and this might take me a while, but just bear with me. If you're an artist and you go to art school, they teach you how to draw like, a cup, a bottle, a figure. And it's very material based. It's a very Western concept. That is the thing you can name, the thing you can possess. And what's left around it is they kind of fluff it off and they say, well, that's negative space. And the greater artists, or the great artists, have real concern for that situation, for the entire narrative of not just what the object is, but where it is, which makes an artist like Morandi more interesting than somebody who just paints a bottle and blocks out the background. When you're dealing with trauma, trauma erases the context because it's a unique situation. So you can't place a declarative situation the way, let's say, Cynthia Ozick can say something like, the muffled wolf's scream in her throat. You actually have to find a way to have it exist on its own terms. Mm-hmm. And as such, what I find is when the great artists in history deal with trauma, and it's very rare, by the way, you'll see like when Goya does the disasters of war, they're very neutral backgrounds. And you also see a neutral background, or what could be mistakenly called negative space, in the work of feminist and African-American artists whose history basically has been obliterated visually, because visual art is a banner of identification. It's permanent. That is, if you put a mural up or a painting up someplace, that reflects the values of the person who either inhabits the space or who owns the picture or whatever. And to do that with something as unspeakable as the Holocaust is very, very difficult. So what you have in, just out of the blue, I'll pick somebody like Rosalind Drexler, whose large blank spaces are in fact a situation of screaming in a sense, or the rather well-known African-American artist, Bill Traylor, who has these figures floating on blank spaces. That isn't negative space. That's the space of that scream that Cynthia Ozick has, but you can't really define it. So when you're dealing with the Holocaust, it's much more difficult to do a painting, because a painting is a declaration of value, speaking of Holocaust art. So you find the people who deal with Holocaust art mostly will either do it abstractly, or they'll do it in a way that doesn't have the malleability of oil paint, but uses another, because the malleability of oil paint allows for doubt and change, and this is not something you want to haggle with. You have this horrific experience that has no parallel in not only your mind, but in human history. There's no identifying mark that you can put. Just bear with me for a second, okay? So when you see a Holocaust art, somebody who deals with the Holocaust, usually the children of Holocaust survivors, you'll see that the context is blank, and just the narrative appears, assuming that the context is too horrific to identify. We see that in these tapestries, by the way, where you have these images floating on these strings, which I can get to later in the conversation. I'll give Ori a chance to speak in a minute. Yeah, okay.
So the context, if I may interrupt you, it's the context that's missing. You cannot really say this. In other words, the details. This was painted in 1942 in Theresienstadt, or this was painted in the Kovna ghetto.
Could I interrupt by taking 2 steps back?
Yeah.
Please.
One, you bring up Primo Levi, and his last volume, Drowned in the Saved, he makes the point, which you referenced. There's no such thing as a Holocaust writer. You don't set out to become a Holocaust writer. Your life experience pushed you in that direction. That was true with Elie Wiesel, who probably would have been a rabbi in a little shtibel in the Carpathians, that sort of thing. We wouldn't know about him. And as Archie says, and writing and visual art is different, but when I ask the question, what do I mean by Holocaust art? First of all, I have to ask myself, when does the Holocaust begin? Second, I ask myself, does it encompass, which I believe it does, art made during the Holocaust? Third, I ask myself, art made during the Holocaust, which you just started to get at, for example, at Terezin or Theresienstadt, which is art of witnessing, or is it art of responding, someone like Felix Nussbaum? Felix Nussbaum was already an accomplished artist, and to the moment they carted him off, amazingly, he was doing that sort of stuff. Or is it someone who is responding without being as direct as Nussbaum is, like Marc Chagall, his White Crucifixion, 1938, right on the heels of Kristallnacht. And everything about that image at the Art Institute of Chicago screams, to use your verb, Holocaust. Or is it, not or, and is it what comes afterwards? And if what comes afterwards, who's doing it and how are they doing it? Archie's talking about how. When I ask who, so you have someone like Shoshana, or you have someone like Alice Locke Kahana, or you have someone like Kitty Kleidman. You have these individuals
Who survived the Holocaust?
who survived, became artists, but rarely do they start doing what you might call Holocaust art until 10 or 15 or 20 years afterwards. Shoshana started in 1968.
Why is that?
Because it must take time to process.
Yeah, exactly.
To process. And in my experience, most of the Holocaust surviving artists use their art as a means of coming to peace in some way, shape, or form with the experience. Whereas their children, if they become artists, are more likely, and again, this is not absolute, more likely to use their art as an expression of anger. And then the question becomes, what about the third generation? Because time has passed now, and perhaps we'll get to that later, but it's something that can be progressive and understood progressively, both in terms of how art is produced just by looking at it, and it can be used, one can think about it, if Mariya were here, we'd be talking about psychoanalytically and physically, is something from the trauma transmitted to the second and third generation in DNA, but that's another can of worms we'll get at, I'm sure.
Archie, why do they need time? Why can't they create the art? Why do we experience years of silence?
It's not
or
dissimilar.
inaction?
I would arrogantly and unqualifiedly assume as what we have with rape victims, where 15 years after the fact, somebody will finally go to the police and say blah blah blah, and then nobody believes it. That's a cultural pressure. What I find interesting about what Ori said is that the children of Holocaust survivors may respond in anger. And I find, getting back to my first point about context, that sometimes the horror is present, as in the work of Charlotte Salomon, for instance, and sometimes it's a later reflection, like in the work of Art Spiegelman. And in both of those, you have the paper as the context. That is, the actual drawn situation doesn't exist. When you ask, why does it take that long? Well, Charlotte was operating in the immediate time, but Art had to wait until he was quite advanced in his cartoon career to sort of take this on. I know that Susan Goodman is here in the audience. Hi there. And when Susan put on this show in '85, I think it was, Art and I were kind of hanging next to each other, and he had the first preliminary pieces of Mouse, and we went out to dinner that night, and I said, why did you do this? And he said, it finally had to come out of me. And he must have been, he lived with that all his life through the trauma of his mother's suicide and the Holocaust memories of his father. Why does it take so long? It takes forever. Also, you have to know how to articulate that. When my kids were at the Yeshiva Flatbush, somebody commissioned me to do a Holocaust painting. I was a kid, I was in my 20s, I don't know. So I figured, what can I do? So I took a lot of dark paint and sand. You mentioned this other artist who uses sand, and I made this like horrific, it was almost a visual cliche, but I really didn't know how to address it. And when I put it up, some of you may be familiar with Yafa Eliach, the great historian of blessed memory. Yafa was married to Rabbi Eliach, who was the director of the yeshiva, and Yafa was a close friend, but very outspoken. And she looked at this and she screamed, having been a survivor. And she said, no, that's not the Holocaust. And I said, what is it? And what she said is, it's all white like snow with drops of blood in it. And I thought, wow, there is such a range of response, but again, it takes that long to process because she had an answer for me. And I was freaked at the answer. That's
Snow and blood in her vision of
Right.
what
Her vision-
Holocaust art
her
would be
vision.
manifested.
Her vision was, I should have painted a picture of just snow with blood on it. And I thought, these are very specific memories, and those specific memories are unique to each individual's surviving children, of what they put up with their parents, negotiating that. And, it's not like we're talking about the American Revolution that we all share, so here's George Washington in a boat. Everybody comes out of mass trauma with a totally unique and personal perspective. And because there's no societal encouragement for that, like there is, we have the 4th of July, there's no encouragement. Everybody has to process that individually and painfully and without support. So that's why it takes 15 years. If it ever does come out, we hear many stories of Holocaust survivors never mentioning it, and going to their grave never mentioning it.
I want to move on to another very general, big picture, blue skies type of a question. I do associate art with beauty. We talked about Elie Wiesel, fiction, literature, although he claimed that Night was not a work of fiction, it was a memoir. So literature in French is belles lettres, the beautiful letters. In Hebrew we say sifrut yafa, beautiful literature. And art, I as a layman would always associate with beauty. I recall that it was Theodor Adorno, the cultural critic, the
He was
music
It's
theorist,
exactly
He was wrong.
wrong,
Yes.
who said that it would be barbaric to
agree.
He
write
was wrong.
poetry after Auschwitz.
He was wrong.
Yes.
He was
How
dead
so?
wrong. Because what both of us have been saying, because art is about beauty, but it can also be about ugliness, but expressed in a compelling way. Compelling can be beautiful. When Artemisia Gentileschi, the 17th century Baroque painter, was apprenticed by her father, a Baroque painter, to his father's friend who raped her, and apropos of rape, and she went to court, the onus was all on her to prove that something had been done to her. There was nothing directed towards her rapist, not an atypical situation. You look at her paintings of the beheading of Holofernes by Judith, and if you don't see her absolute wrath conveyed on the canvas is a magnificent thing to study. It's a horrific act. It's not beautiful in the way that beautiful flowers are, but there's something beautiful about it. On the other hand, there is someone whom I just mentioned, Alice Locke Kahana, who swore to herself, if she survived those 4 camps, she's a teenager, that somehow she was going to turn all those ashes into rainbows. And she ended up eventually in Houston, where in fact they were very taken with the Washington Color School. So color was a thing for them. And this is the 70s, she went back to her town of Sharvar in Hungary, and no one remembered her mother, who had been like, the informal mayor of the town. She was everywhere. No one remembered her. So that's when she realized, I have to stop piddling around with the painting I've been doing. I really have to get with this project. But when that became an exhibition, a whole series of her works, it was called Rainbows from the Ashes. Rainbows from the Ashes. So for her, it was explicitly something that, ugly as it was, she was trying somehow to transform the ugliness into something that was beautiful.
Do you have a clip of hers?
I do actually have one of her images, which perhaps I'll
Maybe
show
at the end
in
of the
shot.
Q&A
Yeah,
we'll be able to.
yeah. So that it depends what you mean by the word beauty. And yes, the flowers are absolutely beautiful, and so, as you say, are blue skies and sunsets. But truth is beautiful.
Yeah. First of all, Yehuda Amichai contradicts Adorno in his wonderful poems, where he says, yes, you're wrong, basically. In open, closed, open. I think I made the title wrong. The last book of his he published, he has a terrific retort to Adorno, and also, Brecht will be singing in the bad times. Yes, they will be singing. I have a friend who believes that Matisse's wonderful cutouts of jazz are, in fact, not happy at all, but depictions of war, with all the explosions and stuff like that. And at first, I thought he was kind of being a little off base. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized these were done about then, and in fact, in retrospect, he might have a point. So, you know, like Ori was saying, it really depends on how one interprets what one thinks is beautiful. You look at that Gentileschi Holofernes painting, and you know, you could hang it in your living room and have a cup of sherry, but you know, if you look at it, you'll throw up your guts. It really depends on how much you're willing to engage and mediate with a work of art. You know, Maya Shapiro has this wonderful distinction between object art and subject art. And
Explain.
well, like, you know, the subject of a group of, you know, again, Morandi bottles could be a bunch of bottles, or the object. The subject could be alienation, loneliness, you know, things that have, you know, that are just represented by this atmosphere. Yeah, beauty is a funny thing. I mean, one can look at a bowl of Cezanne apples and think, oh, it's a bowl of apples. And at the same time, you can think the same thing. Barnett Newman describes those apples as being cannonballs. You know, it's,
And apropos of Barnett Newman, of course, the abstract expressionists, which for 50 years are referred to as if they are dealing only with form. It's about shape, it's about color, it's not about content. There's nothing to do with what's outside the canvas. No artist is immune to the world outside the canvas.
Absolutely.
And you look at Jackson Pollock, the world is exploding on these enormous unframed canvas, so there's literally no frame to separate what's on from off. And conversely, you look at Barnett Newman or Mark Rothko or Adolf Gottlieb, they're putting it back together on the canvas. But they're also asking questions. Barnett Newman, one of my favorites of his, relatively small, is called The Name 2. There is no The Name 1, but it's called The Name 2. It's in the National Gallery of Art, I think, in Washington. It is apropos of snow. It's just white with two little strips of gold. So is that a painting? Absence of color. But what actually chemically is white? Isn't it the totality of color?
Yeah.
Two strips, he's kind of used that triptych form, as Shoshana does in the second of her tapestries. And again, in my experience, it's not absolute. Again and again and again, when a Jewish painter uses triptych form, part of what's behind that form is the question, where do I fit in to Western art, which for 15 centuries has been mostly Christian art, for which the triptych form is so crucial and classic. The Christ child on his mother's lap, the Christ on the cross, flanked by the two thieves, flanked by saints. Where do I fit in? Post-Holocaust, it becomes a question, and where was that Christian God of love and mercy when 1 million Jewish children were being fried in ovens? And Newman's triptych also addresses the question, where was God? The theodicy question. That's a painting devoid of color, so it's not a painting. God is absent. But it's filled with color. God is present, because God was absent and present depending upon who the survivor was. So there's loads of content, is what I'm saying, in this painting.
You bring up something interesting about Shoshana's work. If we can segue into that, just please. I was standing in the lobby before, and somebody had mentioned to me the word evolution, and it occurred to me, you're not looking at evolution. We're looking at the same thing you were talking about with that painter who decided to leave the Washington Colorfield School. Right. At some point, you say, "I'm an artist." You know, Shoshana from the first two tapestries. And the first one, she basically learns her technique. And the second one, she tries to somehow find a way to wiggle her way into some kind of aesthetic costuming for that. By the time she gets to the three paintings on the other side, she has snapped, and she's asked herself the same question. I'm an artist. I'm born. I'm going to die. My life has to have some kind of meaning. There's a reason for me to be here. What is it I have to say? And at that point, you cut all ties to everything. You don't evolve, you snap. And that, I assume, is what happened to your friend in the Colorfield. The same thing happened to me. I was like Clem Greenberg's adored child. He thought I was going to carry on his legacy after he died. He loved me. He finally, when I started to do Jewish work, he just dropped me like a hot potato. You know.
So Archie, you're talking about, we're now talking about Shoshana Comet, and this was a segue. And right before, we spoke about expressionist art of the second part of the 20th century. Before we talk about what happened after the war, I want to ask you about the Holocaust survivors who became artists. my expectation would be that they are not going to delve so quickly into abstract art, but rather want to explain what is actually happening. And I know that during the war, there were Holocaust, there were Jews in ghettos, in camps, who used art as a way of bearing witness, as a way of testifying to the atrocities. One reason was that the Germans had cameras, that they could photograph what was happening, and the Jews did not, for the most part. In what way is the work of Holocaust artists during the war special? And also, this leads me to the second question: how do we distinguish between Holocaust artists who happen to be Holocaust survivors and those who are not?
It's very, very different. If you're living during the Holocaust, you're living with the expectation, like you said, that you may not survive this, so you're bearing witness. So basically, you're being a journalist. You're actually making pictures of what it is you see. After that, the horror becomes so insolently enormous that there's no way to encapsulate that into a visual paradigm. You know, so Felix Nussbaum can say, oh, this is me, this is the gates of the camp, you know, this is my star, this is terrible, you know, luckily I'm able to record this, or Charlotte Solomon can do whatever it is she does until they take her away. After the war, you're trying to say to somebody, no, you have no idea of how horrendous this is. You can't imagine in your wildest dreams. You're not reporting as a journalist. You're actually trying to come with, which is why it takes so long. You know,
So
because
that's war versus post-war.
well, you're processing trauma. And to process trauma, first of all, your first X number of years or decades, you're totally silent. You have no way to express this. You know, what are you going to do? Make a work of art that that is, you know, the usual, you know, the 1950s, 1960s, you know, synagogue sculpture is all the same thing. It's spiky stuff made out of bronze with like hands like this, or, you know, little barbed wire stuff. I mean, what are you going to do? It takes a while for someone to filter that through their own language of creation to actually come to terms with it. Again, we get back to Shoshana's work, you know, and the handful of others, you know, but it has almost nothing to do with each other. They're like two different objects.
But is this a record? Can you look at it as a record that needs to be preserved?
Well, needs to be is something. I mean, you can't force anybody to make good art, you know, and the impulse to go into your studio and decide that more than anything else, more than the pretty flowers, or more than your spouse or your partner, or more than your cat, or more than the trees outside, it's your job to, like, you know, make some images that will preserve the horror that your parents or grandparents went through. That's a big call for an artist, especially when they're thinking about the mercantile possibilities of their work.
And it is, as you said, the break.
Yeah.
Often. Alice went back to Sharvar, and that was the break. Kitty Kleidman, who was 3 to 5 when her brother and parents were hidden.
In an attic. Right?
In an attic, right? So they were hidden. She was a hidden child. She did eventuate as an artist, and she was doing beautiful flowers and fields and things of that sort. In 89, she and her American husband and their 2 teenage kids went back to find the children of the farm family that hid them in the attic of their farmhouse. And when she came back, compulsion. The next 5 years were entirely preoccupied with paintings that reflected the experience that she remembered now, almost half a century later, having had as a child. But what's interesting is you have these very frequently enormous triptychs, and if you didn't know the backstory, and I just gave you the tip of the iceberg of her backstory, you would imagine that she was doing abstract expressionist kind of Rothko-esque light coming in, but a little more literally than the light coming from within his works.
You wouldn't know it's about the Holocaust.
You wouldn't know it. We wouldn't necessarily know it's about the Holocaust.
Something just occurred to me, speaking of that. Because I was part of this Greenberg group as a teenager and as a kid, I became friends with those people, like, you know, Frankenthaler and Olitsky and like the whole crew. And Jules took a great liking to me. Some of you may not know who Jules Olitsky was. He was like one of the top color field painters, which saw itself as a kind of literal extension of like the movement from France to New York of like this, monolithic evolution of art. And Jules was doing very, very well doing these kind of sprayed color paintings. And when I started to do the synagogue murals, and because we were close, he started to get interested in why I was doing this. So as he got older, we would meet for lunch, and he would say to me things like, Archie, what are the colors of the Elyon, of the afterlife? And I'd say, why are you asking? He said, well, I've become deeply interested in this. Because he'd already had his fame, and he already had his money, and the art world was moving on. He became deeply engrossed in re-entering, maybe for the first time, or entering his inherited Yiddishkeit. And so he started to name pictures like Solomon and Sheba. And these are abstract, almost monochromatic spray paintings or something. And towards the end of his life, he named almost everything with a biblical title. I found the same thing true with Philip Guston. From about 1975 to his death in 1980, Philip started to throw like Torah scrolls and Jewish tombstones, especially near the last year of his life. And I maintained that, along with a lot of other critics, that a lot of Philip's work is Holocaust related. It's these tangled legs and horrific black backgrounds and things. At the end of Philip's life, he told me, in fact, he intended to change his name back to Goldstein, to re-engage his Jewish life, and the only request he made for his funeral was that Philip Roth, Morty Feldman, and Ross Feld should say Kaddish over his grave.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's something else aside from just Holocaust remembrance that has to do with the tether that Jewish artists have to the whole field of art, which is basically a Goyish thing. That is, art for 2,000 years in Western culture is a Christian phenomenon. For Jews to enter that is almost like both invading and assimilating. And the notion of assimilation has become so strong that to adopt Holocaust imagery or to adopt Jewish imagery is an act of rebellion against the very hand that feeds you. Here you are with like 2,000 years of Jesus on the cross, and all of a sudden, you're painting, from the Talmud or something. So there's a double edge to doing any kind of remembrance or manifestation of a Holocaust memory or experience. The first is that you're transgressing art in general by daring to bring this Jew stuff into it. And the second thing is you're articulating that with a certain kind of energy and vibrancy that's a double offense. So there's very little market for it, both critical and mercantile. But we're talking about a handful of people. We're not talking about this as a phenomenon. Like, oh, the next generation of Holocaust survivors, children making art. You can name them on the fingers of one hand. It's not pop art. It's a very specialized and very, I would call it courageous move of self-identification. Again, going back to meaning, the same thing that happened to these people that you're talking about. It happens to some artists. It's a thankless journey, and it's basically, as Will Eisner would say, it's a contract with God. It's not publicly discursive. The fact that we're having this conversation here is unique, basically. I mean, okay. Yeah.
Before we go back to art and identity, I have another question about that. If any of you would like to ask our experts a question, please raise your hand. We actually have Debbie has prepared in advance flashcards with pencils. I suppose that they're sharp enough. No cursive. I'm not a native English speaker.
It's like Phil Donahue.
But please feel free to write your question, and I will be collecting. We will be collecting the cards. We would love your input as well.
I'd like to say something else about Shoshana's tapestry, because I don't know how quickly the clock is ticking. There's something about, along with the relentlessness of the strings in those tapestries, about the fluffiness of the material that she chooses to use. And one of the things that I find is most effective in a work of art is not if the work pontificates. That is, if you look at a Sargent or a Franz Hals, you think, oh, that's just great paint handling. But if you look at a Rembrandt, although all that stuff exists, you kind of ignore it and say, gee, what an interesting person that is. You go right through it. And the vulnerability is the catch, because once the vulnerability of a certain kind of naive helplessness presents itself, you're caught. Guston does the same thing. They look stupid, those paintings. You know, but what happens in Shoshana's work is you look at these things and they're brightly colored and they're all fluffy and stuff like that. So you go into them without fear of being caught in some kind of engagement that would make you bare your soul or have some kind of uncomfortable meditative conversation. You look at it and say, oh, a bunch of fluffy stuff on the wall, how cool. And then the gate closes behind you when you realize what you're looking at. And I think that's a great credit to the natural instinct that she had in these tapestries for how to most effectively enunciate the imagery in them. Had she done them darkly, or also there's something meditative about it. It's not the premier coup declarative kind of thing. There's another woman named Trudy Sobel, I believe her name is, who does Holocaust memory embroidery, which is horrifying. It's pretty articulate stuff, but it's all, you imagine somebody making it, it's kind of like, and here's the Nazi with the gun, and here's the dead baby, and like you figure, there's something about the slowness and contemplative relentlessness of the loom, the very act of which parallels the unspeakable horror that's trying to be said.
You don't see that so much in Shoshana Comet?
I do.
You see the darkness.
You do
see the horror.
You see the horror because you're sucked into it. First you look at it and think, oh, it's a teddy bear, you know? No, it's not.
And I know that, Ori, you are very well familiar with many Holocaust artists and with the work of Shoshana.
No, I was going to say, yeah, that of course, she herself, as I understand it, for her, the process of making the art was itself a healing process. It was, and the business that Debbie mentioned, that her arm became paralyzed, and it was psychotherapy that caused her to realize that when she's doing this depiction of the war, it was bringing up memories, and that was what was paralyzing her. And once she became aware of that, her arm became freed up again.
Wow.
And once she finished this series of 5, the number of books of the Torah, that's just accidental. The number of wounds in Christ's body, that's just accidental. The number of pillars of Islam, that's just accidental. The number of faces of the Buddha, that's just accidental. Anyway, when she finished, she put away her loom because she became determined that what she needed to do was heal others, not herself at this point. And that's why she wanted to work further as a psychotherapist.
That's great. Yeah.
So, yeah, it is just amazing. But I was going to say, as a broad kind of statement, she and all these other artists and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens whom we have not mentioned because we couldn't, defy Hitler, who had produced the most destructive moment in human history, the most destructive extended moment in human history. Not only did they survive, I survived, but they produce art. They're creating, and it may take 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years until I have processed and I can do it. But the creation of something defies his destructivity. And I might add further that when a Holocaust survivor artist who has children, and they have children, because by now we're on to a 3rd and even 4th generation, they've defied Hitler 3 times. They've defeated him 3 times. By surviving, by creating out of destruction, by turning destruction into creation, and of course, by producing offspring, if that is the direction that they also go into, as many of them have.
Yeah, again, that impulse is an act of incredible generosity and will. One thinks somehow, as Shoshana must have, and a number of artists in this room who are friends and colleagues, peers, that at some point the society will somehow find a way to mix this or accommodate this into the larger discussion. And the fact is, you can just see what's happening in the streets today. We know that's not going to happen. For 2,000 years it hasn't happened. It's not going to happen again. So you're doing this basically as an act of, haha, I survived. You know, there's a film of the African-American artist Adrian Piper made in the early 80s where she's doing her performance and, you know, explaining, you know, what her connection to the culture is. And she says, well, you know, the discourse now isn't really going to accept this, but like, you know, in 20, 30 years it will. And the answer is no, Adrian, it never has and never will. You know, that is, you go to a museum and you'll see two African-American artists next to each other that have nothing to do with each other, but they're there because they're black, you know. So like if you saw a show of like Jewish artists, you know, you'd see one person who paints like Barnett Newman and somebody else who paints like Chaim Gross, and they'll say, yeah, put them in a room, you know.
And maybe that also has to do with being identified as a survivor. The artist that I studied, her name was Esther Lourier. She actually survived in the Warsaw Ghetto. And after the war, she used to say, please don't call me the ghetto artist. She was considered as a potential witness at the Eichmann trial, and she was fairly reluctant about it. And I remember a video that, Ted, if I'm not mistaken, you actually show on YouTube of Shoshana's testimony, where she talks about the labeling of Holocaust survivors who happen to be artists as survivors, as Holocaust survivors, and they battle with it. And I wonder...
But that's, you know, that is a human problem. We, as a species, you know, to define means to draw a boundary around it. From the Latin root, fin means a boundary or a border. We like definitions. We like things to fit into boxes.
Maybe sometimes we expect them to be survivors. There's something paradoxical about it. If they are not survivors, if they are not sunk in that world of horror, then they would be less of interest to us as viewers. But at the same time, they don't want that definition.
No.
They want to be defined by positive
Every
things,
artist is an
like
artist
courage.
And wants to be thought of as an artist. Not a woman artist, not a black artist, not a Jewish artist, not a Holocaust artist, but an artist. So we, on the other hand, the audience of art, all too often are more comfortable if we can fit artists into different categories. Oh, I get it. He's a Holocaust artist, I see. He's a Jewish artist, I get it, and so on.
And from the experience of the two of you, is it true that sometimes Holocaust survivors who later became artists or were before the war were not comfortable with that label?
All the time.
Of being a survivor or survivor artist? That's
all
common.
the time, yes. But there are exceptions. I mean, there are artists who saw, I mean, Alice Lakahana, I saw her raison d'etre as an artist to turn those ashes into rainbows, but to produce art that reflected on the experience as a grandmother, as a mother. She was not one of those who was reluctant to share her experience. Again, her oldest granddaughter, who became a cinematographer and a photographer of already considerable renown. The two most salient quotes from Kitra about Alice that I cannot ever get out of my head are, quote one, you know, when I turned 14, I had a kind of a sense of crisis because I thought, where was Safta, her grandmother, at 14? She was moving through the first of 4 camps. What have I done with my life? So this sense of, I've got to do something. 2, we'd be getting our hair cut, and Safta would take us for our haircuts. And while we're getting our haircut, she's saying, yeah, you know, it reminds me a little bit when we got to Auschwitz and they shaved our heads. So this is what these kids are hearing. It's interesting. I would not say Kitra was traumatized by it, but she was galvanized by it, or maybe she was a little of both. She in her own right, became a substantial artist. And the interesting thing is everything that Kitra shoots has to do with something of social import. It has to do with a group that is somehow oppressed, whose flag she takes up clearly, and she knows it, inspired by her grandmother's sense of My art is not just to bring back the memory of that community, but it is to galvanize people to think about these things,
Getting back to Shoshana's work on that tack, there's something else that we haven't mentioned, and it's almost unmentionable, but I'm going to mention it. Some of the survivor response, which I have personally witnessed in a number of people, not a lot, but the few I've come in contact with when I was younger, of survivors of the camps, is some of these people, the horror was so much to process that they fell into denial. I don't fault or blame anybody. I hold no judgment. I respect anyone whose experience was that horrific. But I worked for a guy when I was a teenager who was a survivor of Auschwitz. He ran a business, and I was like a stock boy or something. And he would say things like, well, we open right on time every morning, just like the Germans. We're very efficient. And I'm thinking, you just went through Auschwitz. What are you talking about? You know, his nice kids, they went to Columbia, worked hard. You know, he'd go to shul, but because he lived in a, kind of like Long Island community, but he never, ever mentioned anything about his own Yiddishkeit or about his experience. It was always like, every once in a while he'd drop something like, oh boy, the Viennese made the best food. And I'm thinking, Oscar, what's the matter with you? Like I'm 15, 16 years old and listening to this. And I've seen other people. Sometimes you go to a dinner on the Upper West Side and there'd be some matronly person there who was, had a store in Berlin or Vienna or something. And, they would bring out their Rosenthal plates, which may have been made by Nazis. We don't even know where she got them. She certainly didn't bring them over from Auschwitz. And, it was all like, reimagining something as if it didn't exist, as if somehow time stopped in 1934 and they ended up in 1975. So in order for someone to do artwork is coming over that admission and that hurdle that they can reinvest themselves back into life right now and claim their identity and claim their trauma.
And embrace it.
Embrace it. That's a big deal. And that's one of the things I wanted to say about Shoshana's Tapestries, which is why the more I think about them, the more they blow me away, because, at some point what she's saying is, oh, I'm going to reintegrate into society. I'm going to learn how to weave. Okay, second tapestry. I've made a nice aesthetic object, okay? Those two first tapestries have almost no interest to me. They're interesting. They're nice pieces of craft. They have nothing to do with the next three. And the next three, she snaps. And she says, what am I doing? And at that point, the dike breaks. It's like, they're incredible. The more I just saw them for the first time this morning. I saw them in photographs. But the more I think about them, the more courageous and the more articulate they become. And, since we're talking about work in general, I want to redirect this to the specificity of the three tapestries that are hanging here. And as an artist, what it means to actually say to yourself, I'm not going to do this because that would get me public acclamation, a certain kind of adoration, a certain kind of respect. Oh, I like your work. Do you like my work? Let's go have a drink, No, it's not like, I've painted flowers. I've painted the Holocaust. Here's a child being bombed. Oh, see you later. That's quite a move. So I have to give her credit for that, not only self-realization, but the actualization of actually making the work, which is something that many of my colleagues and friends here already understand, or we wouldn't be here. That is, we're talking to the choir, as they say. I imagine half the people here are artists who do Jewish work. So bless you all, but we've all made that decision.
Speaking of the audience, let me address to you a couple of questions from the audience. First of all, the first one, what is the future of Holocaust art? As we know that Holocaust survivors are passing, how important it is to teach about the Holocaust by using art. I can say actually as a historian, we normally don't teach about the Holocaust through art.
So one of the classes that I teach is called The Theological Implications of the Holocaust. And the reason for the title is that it's not about the Holocaust per se, although it is. It's about what are the theological implications. And through the first part of the semester, we're reading these theologians arguing the theodicy question. How in a world made by a God that is all powerful, all good, and involved in human affairs do a million children get fried in ovens? About halfway through the semester, the class starts to realize, wrong question. God didn't build the crematoria and the gas chambers, humans did. It's more of an anthropological than a theological question, or rather the line between the two is much blurrier than one might suppose. Toward the tail end of the semester, we talk about the arts, visual arts, music, theater, what have you, and any number of students become galvanized and inspired by art, because that's what art does. So the first part of my answer to that question is, the Holocaust will always be relevant, or should always be relevant, because of its implications. Because on the one hand, it was a unique event, and on the other hand, half a century before it happened, the Ottoman Turks genocided the Armenians, and half a century after it happened, there was a genocide in Rwanda, and that's just the tip of the alphabet. You can go through every letter of the alphabet and find somewhere where there's been some Holocaust-like act. So it's both unique for various reasons, and alas, it's not unique enough. So it will always be relevant. As for art as an instrument, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, the visual arts are just a transformative and galvanizing experience to understand something that no number of words will enable them to understand. I mean, that's what art started out as 40,000 years ago. There are things we can't describe with enough words, as in God. And visual art has served that purpose going back way, way, way before we have writing or language that we can identify as such. So Holocaust art, in that sense, will always have relevance. And again, if Mariya were here, she'd be talking about psychotherapy and she'd be talking about DNA. The idea of trauma being transferred from one generation to the next, the obvious question is, and how many generations until it runs out, or does it not run out? So we're now dealing with third generation and the beginnings of a fourth generation, post-Holocaust survivor, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, some of whom are artists, some of whom are artists who are interested in this subject. So even in that rather confined and defined way, there continues to be, you might say, a future for this kind of a subject. Until the human race changes and we don't do this stuff to each other anymore, then it could be just a historical artifact.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up these points, but when you ask about the specificity of Holocaust art, we have the Armenian genocide, and what people point to is, oh, here's Archie Gorky's painting of his mother. That's an Armenian genocide painting because his mother died of starvation on the road during. We have the Rwanda genocides. We have the countless, Chinese, whole country murders. The question is phrased in such a way as if this is a unique genocide. And the answer about whether or not there's a future depends on the artist's identification with that genocide. That is, where's the Rwanda genocide paintings? Where's the Armenian genocide paintings? Well, they don't exist. How come nobody's asking that question? And the answer is, like you were saying, how many generations will it last? Well, how many Jewish artists are painting just Tisha B'Av paintings? It's only 2,000 years. It's like, so it depends on how strongly, not the artistic vision, but the Jewish community maintains that as an explicit memory to be recited and revered. And that, of course, will erode in time. Mm-hmm. So when you ask about the future of Holocaust art, well, there's also the imperative for people to move on with their lives. How much time are you going to spend in mourning? Well, in Tisha B'Av, we mourn. Is there a specific time where we're going to drop everything, as they do in Israel, and mourn? Well, the rest of the world, aside from this handful of Jews in the world, couldn't care less. They really couldn't. There's no empathy or sympathy for Jews anywhere, anytime, and we know that. So it really depends on the community's ability, not the artistic community's ability, not the creative ability, for this to perpetuate itself.
Last question, which I'm going to paraphrase. I came upon the work of Shoshana Comet a couple of years ago. This is the first time that I see it in 3D. This is the first time that I meet Ted Comet. We met many times and spoke many times, but this is the first time that it's a three-dimensional meeting. rather than a meeting on Zoom. And I feel personally, but also looking at the questions here, that from that day 3 years ago until now, the world has changed. And that we are now speaking, we talk about genocide, after the worst massacre of Jews. Many of them are children and grandchildren of survivors to take place after the Holocaust. I'm thinking to myself, maybe that's why works of art about the massacres of October 7th have not come yet, because as we talked about, as we discussed, there has to be a period of silence. But I wonder, what are your thoughts about that? Maybe there is no victory? Or you talked about victory, about the shtoch to Hitler that the children and the grandchildren can give. So maybe we're not as triumphant. Shall we expect art on October 7th to come out in the years to come? We have to find a more optimistic note to end the discussion,
Yes.
but
Well,
that's the world we live in.
For someone like Alice or like Kitty or like Shoshana, in a personal way, it's a personal victory over Hitler to have survived, to be creating, in addition, as a bonus, to have created children and or grandchildren and so on. But there is no victory. The massacre of 1,200 people has no victory to it. And the wiping out of Hamas, an impossible task anyway, the action in Gaza, whatever it will produce, it will not have brought back a single dead person, and it will not have removed the trauma that massacre on October 7 yielded. Individuals can for themselves, and that's why Shoshana became a psychotherapist specializing on Holocaust survivors, can for themselves try to find ways to come to some
self-redemption.
Right, but there is no overall group redemption. I know of this guy who was at the rock concert, he survived. And my sister was in Israel about 2 months ago and went on a tour that he specifically gives because of how hard it is for him to do it, taking people to that site, because that's his way of trying to expunge the extraordinary demons that rest inside his guts since that day. That's his way. For someone else, that would be impossible. And that only works for him. And someone else might have another way. And someone, yes, there may be 10 or 15 or 40 years from now, within this ongoing evolution of what we might call Israeli art that specifically addresses that particular trauma. And then we'll see, what it is.
Archie.
Yeah, I think that things are so much in flux right now that it's not, as they used to say, meet to impose a celebratory aspect. I mean, even when we celebrate Hanukkah, eventually the Greeks took over anyway. We're as Jews, I can't speak for Israelis, we are constantly under scrutiny and threat, and that's part of our DNA. We know that instinctively. Whether somebody decides at some point, when some of the smoke has settled, and it's never going to settle entirely, unfortunately, if somebody decides to do something in praise of the martyrs, that would be appropriate, but I can't see it as being a regular occurrence. And as far as Holocaust art goes, as early as the 1960s, people were saying things like, "I'm sick of hearing you Jews whining about your 6 million." So what kind?
I've heard that.
Yes. So what kind of audience, even amongst ourselves as artists, can we anticipate addressing if we do this? And how do we really feel? Like Ori says, there is no victory. All there is at best a neutralization temporarily. And we live with that knowledge. We live with that knowledge. I mean, I hate to say this kind of thing because it doesn't sound nice, But we live with the knowledge that everyone always has and always will hate us. And that's part of how we survive. That's how we live in the larger host communities, some of which are very nice to us. I mean, I love being in America. It's a great place. I've been treated very well, as have most of us. And, every once in a while we get a shot to the head, and it reawakens us. Now, whether we feel like celebrating that in our work or even emphasizing that in our work is a personal, as Ori says, it's a personal decision. So it's an unanswerable question. It really depends on the evolution of the Jewish community and the host cultures in which Jews live to see how we feel like expressing ourselves.
So to end on a positive note in two ways, I would first of all like to make the most positive comment today and invite you all to join the 100-year-old Ted Comet. Mazel tov, we celebrated. You had a birthday
In May. In May,
right?
But who's counting?
We're going to go, for those of you who would like, we will go with Ted upstairs, and we will get another tour from Ted of the Tapestries. And the other positive comment is to thank the two of you. I personally enjoy the conversations and have learned a lot. So to thank Dr. Rand and to thank Dr. Soltes. Yes, Ted, and Ted wants to say something.
First of all, I want to say this is fascinating. It's been even something to hear what you keep dimensions to it. And I thought I had one spot deep as you can, and here that I hope it's been recorded. This is impressive. Just a couple of comments. The only time she really expressed something is when she did that third tapestry by the dialogue with God. She told me that she wanted to put God in the tapestry. Technically, it was not a problem. Technically, it was not a problem. She just yud, and the question is, where do you put it? On top, on the bottom, on the middle. So for weeks, she dealt with this, couldn't resolve it, and what she did was, for the first time, and I haven't seen any other tapestries, she did an open weave. And that openness for her represents the moral void of a world that could permit the Holocaust to take place. So this was the only particular incident I want to say about it. One other thing is, finally, when I asked her, why did you choose weaving over painting? It's so much more complicated. And her response was, because paint comes from chemicals, and a chemical is inert, and a painting, when completed, is fixed in time. Whereas with wool, which comes from a living animal, and you create a tapestry, there's always movement and change in a tapestry, as there is with life itself.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. I'm sure we're sticking around for more questions, but the program ended, and feel free in a few minutes to join us for the tour. Thank you. Thanks for being with us.